everyone. I am starting a new series on American history, modern American history, that is U.S. history since 1877. So we're beginning slightly after the period of Reconstruction. So I want to dive into this, where today our topic is the American West, the expansion westward from the East Coast through the Great Plains to the West Coast, which is quite an immense topic for one session. We'll try to get through it, and if not, I'll end up having to break it in two. So let me jump into this. The American West, modern American history. Here's a picture. Let me do the slideshow from the current slide. Here's a picture of the continental United States, at least modern continental United States. This is a picture of the what do you call it? The ecology, the flora, basically the flora or fauna. Is it fauna or flora? I'm not sure which. So you see in the green on the west and the east coast that you have deciduous trees. That's typical northeastern forests. The dark green is mixed deciduous and conifers. Conifers are pine trees. As you move westward into the pinkish area, you have creosote brush and tall grass. And then finally, as you get into the center part of the continent, you have the light pink area, the Great Plains. It's also been called the Great American Desert. And it's short grass, which is important, as we'll find out later on. And then you begin to move up into the mountains. And you, once again, I didn't mean to change that. Let me see if I can go back. I'm sure you all laugh at my ineptness with technology, but such as it is, I am a boomer. I'll do my best. So then you get sagebrush up in the Great Basin of Nevada, and finally on the west coast of California, you have pine trees again. So that's a little bit about the area. And then we have so let me back up. So 60 million years ago, the Rockies rose up out of the ocean. That was long before anybody, of course, lived on this in this hemisphere, or even long before hominids existed. So the shallow inland sea to the east dried up. Bunch grasses such as blue grama held together a fragile ecosystem. Notice the word fragile. That's important for the history of this area. This area included antelope and buffalo. There were 100,000 Indians living on the Great Plains in the 19th century. Out of those Indians, or indigenous tribal groups, there were 6 linguistic families in 30 tribal groups. Mandans, Arikaras, and Pawnees in the east. Kiowas and Comanches in the southwest, Arapahoes and Cheyennes in the central plains, and Blackfeet, Crows, and Sioux in the north. The Lakota Sioux were originally from the eastern plains, but they migrated west and obtained horses from the tribes of the southwest. Your question might be, where did the tribes in the southwest get horses, since horses died out or went extinct millions of years before there were human habitation? And the answer would be the Spanish, who I want to say invaded. That may be a little bit biased. The Spanish who conquered central Mexico, the city of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, and then they moved up through northern Mexico and into Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and even parts of Colorado and Utah. And so the Spanish brought with them cows, pigs, horses, many of which escaped from the Spanish and proliferated living as feral cattle, feral or wild horses, and the Indians managed to get a hold of them and adapted them to life on the Great Plains. They became excellent horsemen and hunters, hunting on horseback. They were not self-contained, for they traded with the Pawnese and Mandan for agricultural supplies and fur. In their culture, they tended to be egalitarian in their gender. Men and women worked as partners. They traded for steel knives and tools, as such, trading for steel products, they became part of the expanding Euro-American market economy. They also were shamanistic in their religious beliefs. The Sioux believed in a series of powers pervading the universe. This is similar to other shamanistic or animistic religions in the Eurasian continent. The word shamanism is taken from a tribal group up near the Arctic Circle in Siberia, and it is also alternatively translated as witch doctor, which I don't particularly like, spiritual healer, medicine man or woman. Hold on, let me pause this. We have some noise here. Okay, I guess that's the downside of trying to record outside, so I'll continue. Pause button. So the Sioux's religious beliefs, they believed that the universe or the cosmos was sacred with a series of powers. Everything in the natural world had a sacred meaning. W-I was the sun, Skan was the sky, the earth was Mwaka, Inyan was rock, and below these came other powers such as the moon, the wind, and the buffalo. All of these were animated by a spiritual life or spirits. And so this is an animistic view, sacred view of the material world as pervasively filled with spirits. They communed with these mysteries through prayer and fasting. Medicine men provided instruction. Medicine men, i.e. spiritual healers, i.e. Shamans. The vision quest was a religious ritual that was incumbent upon young Sioux as they entered into adulthood. They went on a vision quest, and they had a vision. It attached itself to an object, a feather, an animal skin, or a shell, which was then tied in a bundle and became the seeker's lifelong possession, part of their identity. They also had the sun dance, which is a celebration of rites. Now back to the Great American Desert. In 1820, it was described as almost wholly unfit for cultivation and uninhabited by a people, depending upon agriculture for their subsistence. Maps mark the area as the Great American Desert. This is 1820, remember. And Congress dismissed the Great Plains, they designated it in 1834 as a permanent Indian country off limits to whites. And let me go back to this picture. So we're talking about this central area of the country. 1834, it was designated as a permanent Indian country because it was worthless, obviously. 1820, it was wholly unfit for cultivation. But then after about the 1840s, something changed. What do you think that might be? When was the rebellion of Texas against Mexico? Around 1836. And just a little side note, the defenders of the Alamo were not primarily necessarily defending freedom or democracy. They were defending plantation slavery. I hate to disabuse anyone of their John Wayne hero. I grew up on that as well. But they were almost all defenders of plantation slavery, chattel slavery, and Mexico had decreed abolition of slaves, and they were the central government of Mexico was in opposition to slavery, and the Texans didn't like it, and so they fought back and made Texas independent from Mexico and continued with their plantation slavery. So that was one change. Other changes included the Louisiana Purchase, in which areas in the Great Plains along the Mississippi River that were under the control of the French now were no longer under the control of the French, but under the U.S. government, opening those areas up for colonization, homesteading from the U.S. colonists. Then another thing happened in 42, thereabouts, was the Mexican-American War, provoked by James E. Polk, the President of the United States, motivated in large part by Manifest Destiny, which believed that the United States had a destiny to occupy the entire continent from sea to shining sea. And unfortunately, the Spanish Empire had been in the way up until 1821, and now it was the Mexico that was in the way. And so this war was provoked in order to incorporate Texas into the United States, and also New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And I'm playing for the class a PBS series called Latino American Strangers in Their Own Land, which I highly recommend, which goes in 6 episodes into great detail into this process. So, 1834, it was designated as a permanent Indian country off limits to whites, especially since it belonged mostly to Mexico and was considered worthless. Do I sound a little cynical? I apologize. It's a occupational hazard of growing old. If you're lucky enough to grow old, you tend to get a little cynical. So in 1842, remember what I said about the Mexican-American War, the first wagon train headed west from Missouri to Oregon. If you're a fan of the Yellowstone series, you know that there's a couple prequels. One prequel that I enjoyed is called 1873, and it deals with a wagon train leaving Texas and going to Oregon. And it's kind of a prequel for the TV series Yellowstone. By 1859, the trickle of wagon trains had become a flood. Washington soon began to talk about a railroad to link the lands acquired from Mexico in 1848. There you go. No longer was it considered worthless. No longer was it considered to be exclusively Indian territory, especially when gold was discovered. So Pony Express riders delivered mail between California and Missouri. In 1861, telegraph lines were connected between San Francisco and New York with instant communication from east to west coast of the country. The Union Pacific Railroad was built westward from Omaha, and Central Pacific Railroad built tracks eastward from Sacramento, and they finally met up at Promontory, Utah in 1869. And if you want to watch a great series, fictionalized series on this subject, Hell on Wheels deals with this process of building the railroad across the country. It's entertaining and it's fairly faithful to history. Buffalo country. The Great Plains had potential for raising cattle, but first the buffalo had to be removed. They were in the way. God help you if you're in the way of civilization and progress. So I'll go back to my pictures, which you saw a preview of a moment ago. So in the 1870s, the Eastern tanneries learned how to cure the buffalo hides, and the price of buffalo hides, leather obviously, soared. Hunters began a systematic slaughter of the once vast herds of buffalo. And here's a disturbing picture of buffalo skulls. The Sioux Indians and other tribes who had become horsemen had learned how to live with the buffalo in a sustainable way. They would only hunt what they needed, and they would use the entire animal once they brought down a buffalo. And of course, it required some skill to ride at full tilt on a horse with a bow and arrow and bring down a buffalo. So it was not mass production of slaughter. However, once the buffalo hides became valuable and there was a desire to move cattle out to graze on the Central Plains, the buffalo was in the way and had to be removed. And this happened in the 1870s, and the hunters began a systematic slaughter of the once vast herds of buffalo. This brings us think I had one more picture, or did I? This brings us to longhorn cattle. And you might ask me, why were they called longhorn cattle? And I'll give you a moment to look at the picture and guess. There was about 5 million head of longhorn cattle in Texas. They were not worth bothering with. They had no value. They had escaped from the Spanish colonists a century or so before, or maybe 2 centuries. And so they had flourished in the wild with no particular value. The same thing happened in Argentina, by the way, with cattle. And in Haiti, that is before it was known as Haiti, and the western half of Hispaniola, called Saint-Domingue, something similar had happened with cattle and pigs. And this is where we get the word buccaneer, because they would, Frenchmen living on the western side of Hispaniola would hunt pigs and cattle and cure them over a boucan in French and sell them to passing ships, buccaneers. Well, something eventually happened in the southwest of the United States with these millions of longhorn cattle wandering around in Texas. And so what happened was the railroad changed the economic calculus. When the railroad reached Sedalia, Missouri, it became possible to take a herd of longhorn cattle from Texas. They were worth about $3 a piece in Texas. But if you could get them to Missouri, to the railhead, they were worth $40. They could be shipped to Chicago and mass produced into meat, canned meat, leather, etc. And so suddenly it was profitable to round up longhorn cattle and do a cattle drive to Missouri. And this even extended as the railroad was built further to the west into Kansas, to Abilene, and to Dodge City. It became profitable to round up herds of longhorn cattle. I would hate to get caught on those horns. I don't know why they have longhorns like that. It must have been a particular kind of cattle the Spanish had. But nonetheless, it became a profitable business for a period of time. And this led to the creation of cowboys, or the emergence of what would I call it? A trade, a need, a demand for cowboys. The meaning of cowboy is obvious. They're boys that were herding cattle. Another word for them was buckaroos. That's an old word. You probably haven't heard it. Buckaroos actually comes from the Spanish word vaquero. In Spanish, V and B sound very similar. It's hard for Anglos to distinguish them. So when the vaqueros encountered Anglo cowboys, they said, "We are somos vaqueros." Vaqueros. That sounds like a B. And so Anglos would just transliterate that into buckaroo, which eventually became buckaroo. A little historical trivia there for you. So the cowboys learned this trade of rounding up and herding cattle from the Mexican vaqueros. They were farmhands who worked on horseback for long hours on minimal pay. Many cowboys were Hispanic, African American. The long drive was a way to bridge the gap in the developing transportation system. And now let me, so here are the cowboys, or vaqueros. On the open range, grass was free, so there was a cattle boom in the Central Plains, which was formerly considered worthless and unusable. Now suddenly became very valuable. The grass is free. There was a cycle of good weather. It was easy money. By the 1880s, there were 7.5 million cows overflowing and overgrazing. That's important. The Great Plains. A hard winter and severe drought in 1885 brought disaster to the cattle business. And this area is going to be plagued with ecological problems for many years. Because in the 1920s, once again, there's a over cultivation of the Central Plains, and there's a period of drought and a dust bowl that caused people to lose their farms, to load up their trucks and travel west to California in search of jobs. And there was a great deal of prejudice against these migrant workers from the Great Plains. If you want to read about this, you can read the book by John Steinbeck, or watch the excellent film, black and white, I warn you, called Grapes of Wrath, which deals with this particular problem in history. So, Hispanic shepherds began to bring sheep up from New Mexico, which only worsened the problem because sheep graze differently than cows. They graze close down to the ground and graze the roots, actually, which pretty much renders the grassland useless for cows, which set up a good bit of conflict between cowboys, cattle ranchers, and sheep herders. Settlers and farmers followed behind Buffalo Bill and other Western figures. Land speculators, transatlantic steamship lines, and Western states joined together in an advertising campaign to convince migrants to move west and settle the Great Plains. So much for the Native Americans. The federal government also participated by offering 160 acres of public land under the Homestead Act of 1862. Even the weather cooperated with producing a wet cycle from 1876 to 1886. This is something the United States did consistently through its history that was not done in Latin America. I teach Latin American history. And in Latin America, with this medieval Spanish tradition, land ownership was associated with nobility and wealth and respect. And so most Latin American countries, South America in particular, Mexico as well, did not make it easy for smallholders to acquire land. In fact, they made it difficult. And eventually also made it difficult for the Native American tribal groups that remained after the conquest, who depended on common collective farming and common lands called ejidos. They also began to lose their lands, and they began to be sold off privately. So one explanation for a economic difference between the United States and Latin America is the availability of land. As the United States moved its boundary westward and took land from Mexico, purchased land from France, purchased more land from Russia, there was plentiful land for indentured servants, for immigrants, for poor people to be able to claim and homestead land. This made a major difference in the economy of the United States. It developed a stronger rural middle class, basically. On the Great Plains, men outnumbered women, which was a liberating experience for many women. They were able to negotiate more power in relationships. Oftentimes, if a husband died, the woman was left alone to continue operating her farm on her own, thus having an independence plus some wealth. There was rapidly growing immigration from Northern Europe. Norwegians and Swedes migrated in large numbers to the Northern Great Lakes region. This is one reason why Wisconsin has a different accent, local accent or dialect. In 1982, over 100,000 Swedes migrated to Minnesota and the Dakotas. Let me talk about one more thing. Then I might have to continue this in another episode. There was another group called Exodusters. They were Southern blacks who migrated to Kansas, black farmers looking for greater freedom, racial equality, and economic opportunity. Remember, this is shortly after the end of the period, the Civil War. And now I'm drawing a blank. What was the Reconstruction period, which ended around 1877? And as soon as it ended, and as soon as that Congress withdrew federal troops from occupying the southern states, white supremacy and racism reared its head very quickly with Jim Crow laws and black codes that basically forced African Americans back into a sort of slavery, even though it wasn't called that. Plus, there had been a number of African Americans elected to state and federal legislatures, Congress, mayors, during that period of Reconstruction, and that was quickly reversed after 1877, and lynchings began on the uprise. Of course, the Ku Klux Klan was active, and so there was a lot of negative motivation for black families who depended on agricultural work, farmers, to pick up stakes and move westward to homestead and find their own land. And Kansas became a great destination for this. So in the spring of 1879, some 6,000 black families left Mississippi and Louisiana for Kansas. Kansas had been a free state during the Civil War and previous, as opposed to Missouri, which I believe was a slave state. In the census of 1880, there were 40,000 blacks living in Kansas, the largest black population of any western state other than Texas. Now, the interesting thing is this coincides with the rise of populism, which we'll be talking about in a few weeks. But a populist party sprung up in this 1880 period, largely with a lot of impetus from Kansas, and it came closer than any other independent or third party in history to winning the presidency in 1912, when Teddy Roosevelt ran on a populist platform. And the Populist Party in Kansas was very successful and influential because it was multiracial. So the thinking in Kansas was, I'm a white farmer, you're a black farmer, we have the same problems, we're up against the same adverse conditions, let's join together, whites and blacks in the same economic condition or the same social class, and let's advocate for more rights and more economic opportunity. And that worked. The politics of division are insidious. And one thing that racism has served to do is to divide people of the same social class with the same challenges, so that racism keeps them apart, when if they were to come together, they would be a powerful bloc for advocacy for their concerns and their policy needs. This arose out of Kansas, in large part due to the arrival of these large number of black families working with white families cultivating the ground. And let me think, 13. I think I'm going to stop here and continue with the part 2 next time, because I don't want to wear out your kind attention. So we'll continue and talk some more about the challenges of farming in the Great Plains. We'll talk some about farmers' woes, survival strategies, the fate of the Indians as more and more Anglo immigrants and Nordic immigrants moved into this area. We'll talk about the Plains Indians' resistance and wars between the U.S. Cavalry after the Civil War and the Plains Indians. We'll talk about the discovery of gold in California and the gold rush. We'll talk about attempts to assimilate Indian cultures and families into Anglo culture, which were very misguided and even brutal. And we'll talk about some of the attempts at conservation that arose in the West. To be continued. Thank you for your time and attention. I'll be back. Bye.